Hey everybody, this video will blow your freaking mind, so you want to stick around because you're not going to want to miss this. Alright, we're all familiar with this position where if white plays king d2 or king f2, it's winning for white. And if they play e3 or e4, it's a draw for black. If you're not familiar with this position, I made a whole video about it, going over this position, opposition, how to win as white, how to defend as black. So go check that out if you're not familiar with this position. But what about white's two other moves? We've got king d1 and king f1. Well, the main kind of accepted reason of why king d2 and king f2 are winning for white is because white can get the king in front of the pawn, and with the king in front of the pawn, it's going to be winning for white. If the king's behind the pawn, it's going to be a draw for black. So if we just count the moves here, king d1, king moves to the 7th rank, king moves to the 2nd rank, 3rd rank, or 6th rank, 3rd rank, white's king gets in front of the pawn in time before black can stop white's king. So it should be winning for white, right? However, there's a deeper story to it. So these two moves, king d1 and king f1, are very unhuman-like, but we're going to explore them just for exploration's sake. And this brings us to something called distant opposition. Now, we're all familiar with regular opposition. I've done a couple videos on it. When the kings are, there's one square between the kings, and that's it. That's just regular vertical opposition. But you probably didn't know opposition is not when there's only one square between the two kings. Opposition is when there's any odd number of squares between two kings, and it can be vertical, horizontal, or even diagonal. And sometimes when the opposition is gained from 3 or 5 squares away, it's called distant opposition. And it's kind of an advanced topic. It's easy to learn, but it's hard to master. But that makes it interesting to study. So it's good. So king d1 or king f1, it's the same deal. Even though white will end up getting their king in front of the pawn before black can stop, it's still a draw because black can gain opposition. And here I've highlighted all of the squares that black can move their king to gain opposition. Now, it's important to realize that these are all the squares that black's king, if they can move to that square and have it be white's turn, they would have opposition. Black would have opposition. But it's important to know that not all of these squares are meaningful. Like this square, h1 is not a meaningful opposition square because white's king is not trying to go to the right side of the board. White's king is trying to go up the board. So, and like some of these squares, like f3 here is not even a legal square, f3 or e3. But they're just highlighted just so you can help visualize where the black king needs to be to gain distant opposition. So here, after black plays king d7, it's actually a draw for black. And these squares will stay highlighted, but it doesn't matter what white does here. It's going to be a draw for black. So, for example, white can play king d2, and now all these blue squares, the king can go to any of these squares and he will have opposition. So black here actually has two options to gain opposition, but this is where the next step comes in. You have to determine which squares are A, meaningful, and B, can be maintained. Okay, so these squares are not meaningful squares for opposition because the king is not trying to go there. The king wants to get to the 6th rank, to one of the key squares, d6, e6, or f6. They want to get to one of those squares. And so you need to determine if it's meaningful, and you need to determine if the opposition can be maintained. So, for example, if the king goes to d8, just because the opposition can be achieved does not mean it can be maintained. And so now white is actually winning. And here white can regain opposition by advancing his king and then wasting a tempo with his pawn. So it's really up to you to figure out when opposition can be maintained and when it's meaningful, because it's going to be different in every position. So, for example, this game could continue king e3, king e7, king e4, king e6, and now white wastes the tempo with e3, and white is going to be winning here because black is in Zugzwang. So here, black has to move king d6. He keeps the opposition. And now black can grab and maintain their opposition. Obviously, white can't advance a pawn because the king would be behind the pawn. That would be a draw. We know that. But black can always keep the opposition. White's king will never advance, and black will draw. So, for example, this game could continue king e3. And here, black has to play king e5, maintain the opposition. Once again, this square technically would be opposition. It would be diagonal opposition. There's one square between the two kings. This square would also be opposition. There would be 3 squares between the kings, but this opposition could not be maintained. So neither of these squares work. The king has to come to e5, and this is the only square where the opposition can be maintained and is meaningful out of all the blue highlighted squares. So, for example, if the king tries to go to the left, black's king simply goes to the left, and white can simply do nothing here. And it will be a draw by either threefold repetition, or if white tries to bring the king behind the pawn, it will be stalemate at the end once the pawns reach the end of the board. So that's kind of just an introduction to distant opposition and what it is and how you can use it. And now I want to look at a couple of positions. This position was composed by, I don't know why it's not loading here. Okay, there we go. This position was composed by a person named Silhan in 1977, and FIDE actually tweeted this position a couple days ago, and this position was actually what inspired me to make this video. So the position is white to move and win, and so you basically have to decide here, okay, is b7 going to win, or is it going to be d7? Obviously, it's not c7 because that's not a check. The queen just takes this pawn with check, and these pawns will be eaten, and it's going to be a very easy win for black. So it's obviously not c7. So you pretty much have to decide between d7 and b7 here. So let's take a look at d7 first. And so black has to go king b8 here because they're not going to sack their queen. Then they have to pick up this pawn, and they're not going to be in time to stop the e pawn. And now this allows white to play c7 check. So c7, queen takes c7. So black has to sack the queen for 2 pawns. And here white has 2 choices. So if white plays king d2, it's the first choice, black simply captures the d7 pawn, and you may think, okay, white can now gain opposition with king d3. There's a odd number of squares between the 2 kings, so this is opposition. However, this opposition cannot be maintained. So black can simply play king e7, and white cannot move their king onto their pawn. So now black is going to have opposition. And for example, if white tries to move their king up, black's going to gain opposition. And if white moves their king back, well, now the king's going to be behind the pawn. So it's going to be a simple draw. So that's after king d2. But what if the king tries to go to e2, come around this side? It's basically the same story. King cross d7, king f3, and king e7. Once again, white cannot gain opposition. So this is going to be a draw for black. So d7 does not work. So let's go back to our starting position, and let's try the other move now, which is b7. Okay, so b7, king b8, c7 check. And here you have to sack the queen for 2 pawns. So queen takes c7, d takes c7, king takes not the c7 pawn, but the b7 pawn. This is so they're not wasting tempo going to the other side of the board just to come right back to defend this e pawn. And here here white has 2 options. So they can play king d2 or king e2. And they might not look like much of a difference at first. You might not even think twice if you were like playing from this position in, like a blitz or a bullet game. But there is actually a huge difference because one of the moves wins and one of the moves draws. So king d2, this is the same position we already looked at. King takes c7. Now you're committed. You have to come up on the left side of the pawn. You don't have time to go to the right side of the pawn. So king d3 and not king d6, because that would allow white to gain opposition, and this would be a win for white. but instead king d7, and this is opposition. 3 squares between the 2 kings. Black has gained opposition, and this is this same position, a similar position to what we looked at in chapter 1 of the video. So you cannot play king d2. You have to play king e2, and your plan is you want to come around the right side of the pawn, and that way black cannot deny you opposition. So king takes c7, king f3. You cannot move to d3, and once again I've highlighted all the squares black can move to gain opposition. So black can only gain opposition here by moving to b7. That would be diagonal opposition, 3 squares between the 2 kings. That would technically be opposition. However, this opposition is meaningless because white's king is not trying to go to the left corner of the board or the left side of the board. White's king is trying to guard the e8 square to promote their pawn. So that this opposition can be gained, but it's completely meaningless. So black tries king d6, and now I've highlighted all the squares that white's king can move to gain opposition on black's king. We can see e4, king e4 would be a huge blunder. This would allow black to gain opposition, and it's a draw once again. So white has to move to f4, diagonal opposition, and this is going to be a win for white. So king e6, king e4. White has opposition now, so it's going to be a win for white. So that is the solution. You have to play b7, not d7, because of distant opposition, diagonal opposition. It's an opposition puzzle. So that was the first position I wanted to look at. The second position I wanted to look at is this position from Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, 5th edition. This is diagram 1.8. And it's white to move and draw. So if you want to try to see if you can solve it, you can pause the video now and see if you can solve this puzzle. So the answer is king to h1. This is the only move that draws, which is crazy because it's like everybody knows, you activate your king in the endgame. And to play king h1 in an endgame is just, crazy that this is the only drawing move. But to see why this wins, let's look at a losing move. So king f1 is not the correct move. White now has opposition, so good job, you gained opposition. However, this opposition cannot be maintained, so this fails one of the 2 tests of is it meaningful, can it be maintained. Black can now regain opposition for themselves with the following sequence. King d2 is the only move that wins for black. King f2, white tries to maintain opposition. Now simply king d3, and white must give up opposition. So, for example, king g3, and now black gains opposition with king e3. There's 1 square between the 2 kings. And, for example, king g4 is a move. Now black can play king f2. King takes g5, king takes f3, and black is going to win this endgame. Another variation here, if white plays king g2, king g2, for example, black can play king e2, white plays king g3, black plays king f1, king g4, king f2, and it's the same position. King takes g5, king takes f3, and black is going to promote this pawn and win. So you can't play king f1, which is why you have to play king h1 to gain this distant opposition. So now it doesn't matter where it doesn't matter where black moves, white is going to be able to maintain opposition from a distance. So for example, king d2, what does white play here? White plays not king g2, but king h2. King h2, maintaining that distant opposition. Black plays king e2, white plays king g2, and it's going to be a draw. Black can never really advance either of these pawns here, and white, with the opposition, is going to be able to draw this. And even if black moves their king the opposite direction, king c1, white can simply play king g1, maintaining distant opposition. Black king moves back to d1. You don't go to f1. You have to go to h1, because if you go to f1, you will not be able to maintain that opposition once the kings reach the 3rd rank. So that's how you draw this puzzle. And I have this third position here, which this is really a test of skill. If you think you understand distant opposition, try this puzzle. I was not able to get this puzzle on my first try. So if you think you're a master of the distant opposition, you can go ahead, try this puzzle. And the solution is going to be linked in the study below in the description. So try it, set it up on your chessboard, go through a bunch of variations. And once you think you have the answer, you can check the study in the description. It has an answer, a bit of explanation. And that's all I have on distant opposition. Once again, like I said, it's easy to learn, really hard to master, which makes it a lot of fun to study. How practical is it in games? It's actually more practical than you may think. Think of any time you use regular opposition, there's probably also some opportunity for distant opposition tactics. So it's important to really be aware of this. And I hope this video blew your mind, because I've known about distant opposition for years, but I remember the first time I read about it, I was like, whoa, that is super crazy. And I don't think I have anything else to say. So good luck with this puzzle, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to like and subscribe for more daily chess content, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.